Welcome to the Independent Review, a weekly podcast where we bring you the latest from the world of independent journalism. Whether you're a news junkie, a curious learner, or just looking for a fresh perspective away from the corporate media, this is the show for you. So join us now as we dive into the world of independent journalism on the Independent Review.
Welcome to the Independent Review. This week we have clips from Ryan Cristian, the Union of the Unwanted, the Indie News Network, and James Corbett. Now, let's jump to our first clip from Ryan Cristian.
Now let's talk about the actual recent false flag. Here's what Zelensky put out. You know, the same Zelensky that still swears that that rocket that was fired from Ukraine, which we've all proven, and it hit Poland, was still somehow fired from Russia, and it was an attack on Poland, and he lied. And everyone just kept going because we can't care. We can prove that it wasn't there. We can prove mathematically that it wasn't even there. The point is, this guy's terrible. He's clumsy. He's incoherent. He clearly has a drug problem. And the bottom line is that he's just throwing things out left and right. It doesn't even seem he's in control. That's my biggest concern about what happens on the ground. The U.S. government, as we saw in Syria, is kind of forced to go along with. So here we have an example of a dam, a very important dam, a hydroelectric power dam being blown up. And he immediately goes to Twitter and says, Russian terrorists, the destruction of the, Kakova hydroelectric power plant dam has only confirms for the whole world that they must be expelled from every corner of Ukrainian land. You know how many times he's been caught lying? It's just painful, which shows you how desperate they are to maintain this, that they can't back up now. Ghost of Kiev was a lie. Raping children was a lie. I mean, it's lie after lie after lie. And we're all still conspiracy theorists somehow. Same reason these injections are still safe and effective, right? Because they say so. Not a single meter should be left to them because they use every meter for terror. It's only Ukraine's victory that will return that security. And this victory will come. Clearly not. They're losing. The terrorists will not be able to stop Ukraine with water, missiles, or anything else. All services are working. I have convened the national security, blah, 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 blah. Okay. It just shows you the picture of the dam and the water. Now it's pouring through. First, Dr. Strangelove says, some basic logic, not proof, but just logic. If anyone thinks the Russians blew up their own dam and flooded their own positions, making an amphibious assault possible on them while cutting off the water supply to themselves, seek help immediately. It's curable, but it may take time. Now, it's certainly possible, either by accident or by design. But realize strategically how stupid this is, militarily how absolutely ridiculous this is, and just simply that you're going to hurt yourself. To what end? How does this benefit their military or just any agenda at all? To what, to say they did it, it's them. Well, he already knows well as anybody else in the world that the U.S. government's never going to admit it was, no matter what happened. So how does that ever translate to a benefit? This does matter. This is why it's so stupidly obvious that no matter what anybody's arguing, that this is clear before we even get to the next part, which is that you can prove on the record that Kiev has plans to blow up this very dam more than once as a last resort, which, by the way, happened right after they just lost a huge battle. But we're going to pretend it was Russia after they planned this and execute. Come on. I mean, this is how stupid this gets. This is the author, the writer, twice last year, and you can look at him right here. Ukrainian officials discussed how to blow this dam up. That should mean something, shouldn't it? Facts and it just shows you narrative is all that matters. We say Russia because that makes sense for the narrative. Facts don't matter after that. Like every other conversation. The Washington Post in late December extends credence to the Kremlin's version of events, saying that they were planning this. The Washington Post makes that clear. The test was a success, but the step remained was last resort. So they were holding off to do this. They knew they could. They were holding off until they needed to. And then what happened? They lost this last important battle. Aramate points out the same thing, the Washington Post. Zelensky's blaming Russian terrorists, yet the U.S. involved war games last year. The U.S. involved, of course, because that's how you need to read this. There's nothing happening in Ukraine that is not at the least extension being done because of the United States, whether they know it or not. The Ukrainian military tested a scenario in which Ukraine bombed the dam to stop Russian crossings. The test was a success. And this is just a quick understanding of what this is doing. So this is what the Ukrainian military is allowing on their own people to essentially make Russia look like the bad guy, even though anybody with 2 brain cells is going to say, well, that doesn't make sense. The destruction of this dam means the left side of Kherson will be flooded soon, including several villages. Crimea will have water supply cut off. Crimea being a place that Russia controls. But that makes sense, though, right? They're going to hurt themselves and potentially allow Ukraine to be able to do this. That's why the USSR built the dams in the first place. No water equals no agriculture. You can figure out the rest. This might impact millions of people. Now, I don't know why I do that. Wyatt Reed points out an obvious point that's important. They just blew up the dam from the makers of Russia blew up their own pipelines. Russia blew up their own nuclear plant. Russia blew up their own people. This is how done. And guess what? We've proven they've lied about these. No, they didn't blow up the pipeline. No, we've proven that. Ukraine accuses Russia of nuclear terrorism after strike near the power plant. The bottom line is this is a lie, and we've also shown that they were bombing directly on that plant once the Russians took over. So it's a lie. 30 civilians killed in Russian strike. So claiming that they're bombing themselves at the same point. They're lying about all of these, which we've proven. And then Disclosed TV points out, just in, CIA had intelligence of detailed Ukrainian plan to attack Nord Stream pipeline 3 months before it happened. So at the very least, you have very disingenuous coverage from the corporate media, from the government of the United States, where they clearly knew at the very least that, on their narrative anyway, that Ukraine had a plan to attack Nord Stream, which wouldn't surprise me. That plan is being put forward by the U.S. government. The point, though, is that whether or not it was Ukraine or whether this is the U.S. government trying to blame Ukraine as if they didn't have any involvement with that is up for you to decide. I don't believe anything Washington Post says. Biden admin learned from a close ally that the Ukrainian military had planned a covert attack and then has yet to say any of that until now. While going, we know it was Russia, you liars. It's just so dumb, isn't it? Well, Zero Hedge points out, or first the War Monitor says, President of Ukraine says on Wednesday that he was very disappointed and shocked that no one believed him. And the Red Cross, the emergency at the power plant, basically, why doesn't everyone believe that I lied about Russia doing it? And Zero Hedge points out, well, time for quote, Russia to blow up another dam? Well, that might have already happened. They're trying. Arthur Morgan, what is wrong with me today? Armed forces of Ukraine shelled the vicinity of another dam. This was 7 hours ago, of the Belgorod Reservoir. So it's clear what's happening, guys. Over the past couple of weeks, arrivals in this territory have become more frequent. Is this a pattern? This is the wholesale destruction of everything that's going to keep this. This is about, in my opinion, not just the control of the war or controlling the loss of the war, but the Great Reset. All of this adds up in the same direction, guys. It's just a multifaceted agenda. Now, while all this is happening, while Ukrainian Nazis and neo-Nazis and fascists and the ones funding them and arming them and executing these sabotage, false flag terrorism attacks, while all that's happening, guess who the U.S. government's concerned about? The group not doing what they claim they're doing, right? We won't allow Iran to get nuclear weapons. They're not getting them. They're not seeking them. The IAEA just literally pulled out and said they literally stopped, and Israel freaked out. Because apparently, after the last 20 years of pretending to investigate, the point is, even Amano, the previous president of the International Atomic Energy Agency, mysteriously died. And right before that, he openly stated that the U.S. and Israel were trying to kill him. Remember all that? And then the moment he died, after years of saying that Iran's not doing this, suddenly the new people are like, yeah, they're dangerous. The point, though, is even that group just went home. Because there's not a problem. Because I've proven this 100 times over. The Iranian government not only makes it clear that both their religion as well as their personal standing does not allow for them to do so. And even as you can prove, unless you have some secret location, which is what Israel claims, but yet every year and every time they say, it's not happening. Investigations, fake evidence. But yet here we are. Yet how long ago? They've been saying this for 20 years. The point is, they don't even have their light years away, even with their increasing of their production because of the violation of the deal, the JCPOA, which, by the way, was written down in the deal, that if the U.S. does what they did, they're allowed to do what they're doing now, and yet the U.S. still frames it as illegal, which is just absolutely ridiculous. The bottom line is that they are not even close to being able to produce the things at the level they need to begin to make a bomb, let alone have a nuclear weapon. But right now, we're on the border, on the verge of giving these kind of weapons to Ukraine, which they've already discussed and probably have already done, but we're worried about something that's not happening. This is the crux of the absurdity of where we are today. They don't care about anything other than their agenda. They are literally on the brink of destroying the world in 1,000 different ways, whether through infertility in children or blowing us up with nuclear weapons, and nobody cares. Because these are dangerous people. And and while that's all happening, you know what's also going on? The Ukrainians are continuing to target and shell innocent people in civilian areas in Donbass, just like they've been doing for 20 years, or 10 plus years. Yeah, this is also happening. Jay Boys points out that the BBC, the CNN, they're shamelessly ignoring the indiscriminate shelling of Belgorod in Russia by Ukraine, targeting and killing innocent people. Isn't it amazing that Russia hasn't just completely freaked out about, like, imagine what would happen if the U.S. government had somebody bombing inside of their country. Think about what an crazy escalation that is. And yet somehow Russia hasn't just become what they keep saying they are. That's called restraint. In no way am I praising all of these governments are bad. It's just a simple fact. They ignored it like the Donbass for 9 years. Excuse me, I think I said Donbass to start. The point is that they've ignored this like they've ignored Donbass being targeted for 10 years. You can see, look, these are just showing you burning civilian areas. It's just so incredible how obvious all of this is. And Sarah Abdallah points out, on top of all of that, Joe Biden's bombing Somalia right now. Did you know that? No, you probably wouldn't, because the corporate media doesn't care. No UN condemnations, no global outrage, little to zero media coverage. If it were Putin instead of Biden bombing Somalia, well, headlines would dominate every single outlet. And remind me again, do we have a declaration of war on Somalia? No, we don't, but it doesn't even matter anymore. We are so far past even pretending we need those things, or that they do. They don't think you matter anymore. They never did, but now they're putting it right in your face. Now, I won't play this, actually. I'll let you watch for yourself. But Kim Iverson had a great interview with Gonzo Lira's father. Now, I haven't talked about this much. I mentioned it a couple times, actually. But there's a lot about the last story, as I mentioned before, that kind of left me a little bit unsure about all this. But you can see video of Gonzalo Lira being arrested at his home. And this is his father pleading with the U.S. government to do something and save him. You know what they've done? Literally nothing. When asked about it in a State Department briefing, they didn't even care. So it shows you how much they care about U.S. citizens, right? You can imagine if this was any U.S. citizen held by Russia, oh, they would suddenly care then, which shows you they don't really care. It's about politics. Very, very sad. Very important. We just really got to keep knocking these things down. And we can't be afraid. We can't be afraid to be called names. I mean, look, there are people that follow along with me and claim that I'm this and that based on the most obscene, just asinine things that have no, support, saying this guy got censored and suddenly you're everything they want you to be. The point is that there's a lot of children, a lot of vultures, a lot of trolls out there that are just out there to do something for themselves. That's not going to stop us from doing what we're going to do. I'm going to keep doing what I think is right, period. These people they're meaningless. But the point is that we have to keep pushing forward, and we can't let these jackasses out there influence what we want, what the truth, the way we see the truth. Unless you're willing to stand up and tell your neighbor what you think about this without worry that they're going to, or regardless of what they might think, unless you're willing to do that today, we're not going to see real change. I'm willing to bet you that you tell your neighbor what you think, they're probably going to agree. In some level, they're going to go, yeah, I'm worried about this. If you're talking to them one-on-one, test the theory. Realize you're the majority. Realize that when we do acknowledge that as a country, that we will change everything. I'm not going to say I know what that looks like. It's obviously going to be it's going to be difficult to get this to a place we want, but nothing worth doing is ever easy, guys. And we're here to fight for the long haul. Thank you for being here. And again, anybody out there that wants to have them reach out to us if they want to fund this platform to something that we can really, we're going to keep driving, as I keep telling you, no matter what. The problem, though, is that with the declining in donations in general, which it seems that everyone's dealing with, there's going to come a point we're going to have to pull back on content and so on. And I just don't want to do that. It's very hard for me. But, people may not know there's plenty of times and plenty of months here and there where I'm paying out of my own pocket to keep this going, because I don't just put money aside. Every single cent that comes through this platform, if it's left over, I'm like, Robert, Derek, let's write more. Let's get more content, because that's what matters. I'm not in this to make money. It's about getting the truth out there. And at every single turn, we're being suppressed and sidelined and ignored, even by other independent media. We're going to keep fighting because that's what needs to happen. And so I'm hoping to find people out there that recognize why that's so important and why this is about something much bigger than just making money. But at the same time, the investors need that. But the point is, if you know somebody out there that's like that, have them reach out to me. Show them this part of the video and let them know that we're real and that we're trying to change things. And I believe we can. I believe we have. Let's put it that way. And we will continue to. I love you all. As always, question everything. Come to your own conclusions. Stay vigilant.
Next, let's take a look at this clip from the Union of the Unwanted podcast on Homesteading.
And today we have a great show. We had a lot of help putting this together by Miss Monica Perez, who helped out quite a bit putting this great group of people together. And we're going to be talking about homesteading. We're going to talk about farming, food. You see a lot of supply chain issues. You see a lot of people being much more open-minded to homesteading and kind of growing their own food and whatnot. So we're going to get into some of those topics and anything else kind of connected to it. Monica, because you were a huge help, not to put you on the spot, but is there any specific topic, any direction you would like to kind of start off with?
Yeah, I have a friend, a guy who I've had on my show a couple of times, a lawyer who's hanging up his practice and just bought like dozens of acres of land in, I think, Oregon. And I was like, whoa, how do you do that? I mean, I feel like you're going to want to start a little slower, whatever. But I had the idea of getting this group together and talking about kind of how you get started. People here have started from nothing, have gotten huge pieces of land. So I was curious about that. And then I also wonder how you can dedicate yourself to this endeavor and not totally disconnect in case the government comes through your right to collect rainwater, or like with COVID or the avian flu, they want to slaughter your chickens. So I wonder, how do you get started, but how do you keep from just completely getting off grid and being vulnerable? So those are my two kind of bookends of the beginning and the end of what I'm interested in.
Yeah, and I think a huge part of this is this idea that we don't have enough food for everybody, right? Like, it's constantly fear mongering. There's not enough land. There's too many people. How do we feed everybody? How do we do it ethically? Sometimes you hear the argument that factory farming is a necessity, and that's the only way you're going to feed everybody. And I think Joel could hit on that. I think some of you guys might know Joel. He's been on the Rogan podcast a few times. He's written a bunch of books. He's been on a bunch of documentaries, and he has an amazing business and farm, and just incredibly knowledgeable into these topics. Joel, do you mind maybe hitting off some of these topics by giving us a little bit of what you do with your farm and your business?
Sure. Well, thanks for having me on. It's a real privilege and an honor to be with you. So our farm is in Virginia's Shenandoah Valley, which is on the western side of the state. And so we're 3 hours from Washington, D.C. We're definitely on the Atlantic side of the U.S. And, we came to the farm. I was just 4 when Mom and Dad bought this farm in 1961. Dad was an accountant. Mom was a school teacher, and the off-farm jobs paid the mortgage. That's a typical thing. And our first 10 years were primarily basically a glorified homestead. We grew all of our own food, milked a couple milk cows. Had our own eggs. I got my first chickens when I was 10, so I was the chicken man in the family. I had the chickens. And just loved them. And I loved the farm. I loved all that. And my chicken business kind of grew, and I grew with it into my teens, started supplying a couple restaurants and a couple schools and numerous families. And that gave me, spending money throughout my teen years. And so I'm sitting here thinking, well, how do I Dad and Mom never made a living on the farm. So the mortgage got paid in about, 12 years. Now we're debt free, but there's no going concern. How am I going to make a living on the farm? And my first plan was, well, I'll milk about 10 cows, sell the milk at retail, not high price because it's organic or grass or anything, just regular supermarket price. I can make a nice living milking 10 cows. The only problem was the government said that was illegal to do. And so, that didn't work. And so, so when I started, then I went to town and, I was gifted. I had a knack for writing. And so I became a journalist at the local daily newspaper, lived here at home. Teresa and I got married. We fixed up the attic in the farmhouse. I'm sure it was illegal. We didn't ask, we didn't tell, we didn't get a permit, but we made an apartment in the farmhouse, drove a $50 car we bought from a neighbor. Grew all of our own food. She canned, 800 quarts of stuff a summer out of the garden. That's what we ate on. If we didn't grow it, we didn't eat it. And I always said if we could have grown toilet paper and Kleenex, we could have pulled the plug on society. And from those humble beginnings, we just began direct marketing, building up a little customer base, selling our beef, and then we added the chickens. And today. We have about 22 of us that make a full-time living here on the farm. We service about 10,000 families. We ship nationwide, service a couple dozen restaurants, some institutions, some kind of boutique grocery outfits. And it's quite a, we just wanted to be full-time farmers, but we were early on there in the 80s. I came back to the farm full-time September 24, 1982. That's a big day in my life. I walked out of that paycheck and came back to the farm. We had saved up enough money to make it for 1 year, and we lived on $300 a month, and said, you know what, we can make it for a year. And that little nest egg just hung on, and we made it 1 year, then we made it 2, and by the end of the third year, into the fourth, we kind of took a deep breath, said, "Oh yeah, I think we're going to make it." The little engine that could. I think I can. And by about year 4, we felt like, okay, we're going to make it, and it's just grown. So this was in the 80s, and then in the 90s came along. And, people started getting more concerned. The whole local food movement developed, organics developed, all that. We were way ahead of that curve. And now the basic cultural awareness of our kind of food is way, way bigger, than it was back in the 70s and 80s. But that's okay. We've just grown with it. And now we're kind of an old dog in the pen, but it's really been fun to we feel like Cinderella. We've been in the ashes all of our lives, and all of a sudden now we get invited to the ball, and then Putin invades Ukraine, fertilizer goes up 400%, and we're just sitting cool because we don't buy any of it. It doesn't affect us at all. So when Tyson goes and raises prices 32% in 1 year, we only have to raise them 10% just to keep up with inflation, but none of our other costs have gone up. And so we're starting to realize that what we've been laughed at for so long by the conventional orthodoxy is actually far less fragile and more resilient to these kinds of black swan events and problems, because we're less dependent on outfits that sometimes have nefarious agendas.
Now,
Well, I have a question for you.
Go ahead.
Do you feel like, they say half of all businesses go under or whatever. Do you feel like other people doing what you did, that it was a moonshot? Or do you feel like it was one foot in front of the other, and anybody who persevered could at least make a living?
Yeah. Well, there was certainly nothing. Look, they talk about business, location. We were not in a good location. We're on a dirt road. We're not in a metropolitan area. We're not close to markets. But what we had, I think the advantages that we had, the main advantage was that we were hungry. We didn't have money. I left outside employment. I threw everything on this. We were completely dependent on it. And when you're hungry, you get really creative. And so certainly I've seen, like you, I'm sure I've seen many people come to this and put in their 3, 4, 5 years, and then they're out. You see this. And normally they either aren't willing to put in the long hours it takes to to start with the infant business. I mean, you got to change a lot of diapers in an infant business, okay? And it just is what it is. A lot of babysitting. But the second thing is just being business savvy enough to watch your pennies, watch your cash flow, and just basic good business principles, integrity business principles. And so there's way more to this than we don't use chemicals. It's how do you substitute, so when other people were buying fertilizer, we bought a wood chipper so we could generate carbon. When other people were making contracts with Tyson, we were out knocking on doors, finding customers in our community that wanted to buy, good chicken. It was just a complete inversion of the normal orthodox approach, and it paid off.
Now, I did open up by talking about the idea of like, is there enough food to feed everybody? Is it, in your opinion, is factory farming, because that was a topic that, you start seeing documentary after documentary, demonizing factory farming. And then you'd hear the argument of, oh, but this is necessary to feed everybody. Like, what's your opinion on those topics? Is it possible to have a farm like the one that you have and feed, the globe, or is that just not something that's realistic?
Not only does our kind of farming can it feed the world, it's actually the only system that can long term. As we've seen the disruptions in the system, Monica mentioned high path avian influenza that's decimating things at the top of the program. That's a big deal, and so we're just seeing we're seeing cracks. The factory farming system has been, we could say for the most part, basically a century in developing. And what happens is these, when Joel Arthur Barker wrote the book Paradigms in the 1970s and brought the idea of paradigms to the world, one of his axioms was every paradigm eventually exceeds its point of efficiency. And so what we're seeing now is that as antibiotics, mechanization, cheap fuel, basically cheap petroleum floated the factory farming system, because it's an energy intensive, capital intensive, infrastructure intensive system. As it floated that system, as all of that begins to crack, then what happens is the old platforms that have fed the world for a long time. Now, I'm not a Luddite. I love technology, but the basic platforms are now showing up with our technology. Now we can duplicate what nature did so well. I think the quickest way to answer your question is to realize that 500 years ago, North America produced more food than it does today. Now, humans didn't eat it all. We had 2 million wolves that needed 20 pounds of meat a day. We had 200 million beavers that ate more vegetables than all the humans in North America today. We had flocks of passenger pigeons that were so big. Audubon sat under a tree in early 1800s, and he recorded in his diary, he said, I haven't been able to see the sun for 3 days because the passenger pigeons blocked out the sun as they flew over. Who has seen a flock of birds so big it blocked out the sun for 3 days? So, the amount of food in North America 500 years ago exceeds what we've done today with chemical fertilizers, the Green Revolution, John Deere tractors, plows, and Monsanto. And so it should give us all pause to realize that we have actually not produced more food. Now, I'm not saying we're not producing more food than old hillbilly farmers did 100 years ago. I'm saying nature, the unmolested, the Native American, pre-European production exceeded what we have today, if you take the whole cumulative nutrition package. And so we actually dare to ask, well, if that was so productive, how do we duplicate that on a commercial scale today? Does
anybody want ask a question or expand on any of these topics? Jay?
Yeah, thanks for inviting me here, Tim. I wasn't planning on being on with Joel Salatin. Joel, you're one of my heroes. I'm from New Hampshire. I moved here for the Free State Project. I started a homeschool curriculum I call Man Camp. And Man Camp originally started as a blacksmithing, teaching young kids how to blacksmith. And the idea is I want there to be people who don't want government, and people who have confidence don't need government. So if we can instill confidence in young minds, then the future generations are going to require less government. One comment that I wanted to make to what Joel went on here about this big corporate farming, and he may have said it, but maybe I missed it, is what's floated this cheap food also is the massive government subsidies. I grew up, my dad was a horse trader. I grew up going to horse auctions during the week, and then going to rodeos. I rode the hunters and jumpers. I rode dressage. I did, team roped and calf rope because we had to sell these horses. And then one of my kids just climbed up here. And then and then I went on to be in the hay business. So I started brokering hay at 12 years old. I had my own cell phone in 1997 at 17 because I was a hay broker, and I was brokering hay for 3 hay dealers. And then by the time I was 16, I had my own hay trucks. By the time I was 23, I had several hay trucks, a couple semi trucks. We were doing good with it. I was a 300-pound fat truck driver eating all the junk food on the road. And when I was and my stepfather, a guy named Trent Cook Farms, Hudson, Colorado, where my mom moved out to when I was a little kid. I used to go out there and visit for 6 weeks every year. And then when I got to be about 21 years old, I started working on his corn harvest crew. And so I got to see the whole Republican welfare whore farmer scene, where these guys, they love Monsanto. Monsanto just makes them so much money. They love the government subsidized crop insurance. And these guys, are what I refer to as the commodity cowboys. Well, anyways, so I did harvest crew, ran corn chopper. I packed silage pit. We worked on dairies with Lost Creek Dairy, 6,200 milk cows, over 13,000 head on a dairy. So I did that from 2013, 14, and 15. And I was like, 30, 33, 34 years old, working with a bunch of men my age, and they were all on low testosterone medication. Almost all these guys. But these guys were like playing with the Roundup and playing with the atrazine, and they're like, they didn't take that stuff seriously. Like, I see these guys, you got Roundup all over their clothes. They're not wearing a hazmat suit. They're getting it on their skin. And I don't know if you ever picked up a jug of concentrated Roundup, but that stuff's about 12 pounds per gallon. It's like 50% heavier than water. Anyways, I came back to New Hampshire. I stayed in Colorado. I made a lot of money. I worked, 80 to 100 hours a week for a couple of years, saved a bunch of money. Bought gold and silver and Bitcoin while I was out there. Came to New Hampshire for the Free State Project. Bought a 12-acre homestead. I found a woman at Pork Fest, made her my wife. We got 2 babies now, and I did not want to be a farmer until I was here on my homestead. I was like, yeah, I'll have a homestead. I didn't really want to farm. I was totally happy with trading with people, my services, which I started a heavy equipment repair business. And when my daughter was born, I was like, I got to teach this kid to be competent and useful by the time she's old enough to have her own kids. And that's a short window. So, and actually, you got to teach the kids to be competent and useful. I'm concerned. You got to teach them to get their dopamine hits from hard work before they're 6 years old. Because whatever you teach them before they're 6 years old, whatever they enjoy, whatever they get their dopamine hit within that first 6 years of life, that is what they are going to love for the rest of their life. That is what's going to bring them happiness. So my daughter, we had chickens. My daughter was February 2020, right in the beginning of the scamdemic. We were in the hospital. We had to have a C-section. This is the first time I had watched a television probably in 14 years, sitting in that hospital, and all this nonsense about all this stuff going on. So I'm looking at, I'm like, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? I got to raise her the way I raised her. I did not want to be in the horse business. I did not want to be in the hay business. I did not want to be away from home. I wanted to be at home. So a friend of mine in Bardo Farms, Croydon, New Hampshire, they are free staters also. They've been, butchering a couple of pigs a month, raising some pigs, doing like a cow a month. They had kind of an operation that was going along, and but it was small time. Their butcher was just a guy out of a garage, and I started being friendly with these guys, helping them work on their equipment as I met them. And Neil sends me a message. He goes, "Hey, there's these market hogs that they're going to euthanize in Pennsylvania. They're $100 a piece and they're 350 pounds. These hogs had $500 worth of feed in them." So we make a deal. So I still had all my equipment from my horse trading days. So I had my 24-foot aluminum stock trailer, my Cummins diesel pickup truck. And I call my brother. I'm like, "Hey, let's go get some hogs." And he's got a 34-foot stock trailer. He's still in the horse business. We're going to go down to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. We're going to get some $100 hogs. Let's load up all the ones we can get, bring them home. Because Bardo Farm had no meat. They sold out of everything. Because what happened is all the people that knew who these guys were but weren't supporting them were going to the grocery store. They weren't supporting their local farmer. But when things got scary, they're like, "Oh, I need to fill up my freezers with meat." So they went and they wiped these guys out of meat. So 2 days before we're going to go get these hogs, the farmer calls us and he says, "I can't sell you these hogs. I can't give them to you. I have to kill them." He says, "I have to euthanize, I can't remember how many thousands of hogs," because he was a Tyson producer. And I'm like, he's like, "You guys just can't come. I'll get sued." My lawyer told me to take that ad off of Craigslist. This was a Craigslist ad. Tyson basically said they were going to sue this guy. So I'm like, wow, this is pretty crazy. So I called up some livestock brokers in Massachusetts that I used to deal with, guys, because I used to go to New Holland, Pennsylvania, to the livestock auction, and a lot of times in the fall I would haul horses down to sell, and I would buy cows for guys and bring them home. I'd buy calves or whatever my buddies wanted. I just come home with a full trailer for them. And so, anyways, I'm like, "Hey, we need to get some pigs. We need to get some pigs." And one of the guys finds pigs in Illinois for free, piglets. They are weaned. They got like their teeth stock, the insides, all the stuff these commercial guys do, for these piglet operations. We can't go anywhere with these pigs. We're going to have to euthanize them. So I'm like, wow, well, all right, what are we going to do? So I call a guy that's in the cattle hauler. He goes over there. I send him out there with the cattle pot. He puts on 860 piglets in his cattle pot, and he runs them back here to Massachusetts. I go meet the guy in Massachusetts, about 125 piglets in my stock trailer, and then I come home, unload them. We had just set up some pastures. My daughter is 4 months old, and I got her holding the hose, watering the pigs. I got her taking grain out of a grain scoop and just throwing it at the pigs, and the pigs are going after it. That kid squealed as loud as those pigs. She was so excited about feeding those kids. I saw pleasure like I have never seen anyone experience before. She was getting a dopamine hit, and I knew I was on to something. A week later, I went down and got the other 125 piglets from the guy where they were in Massachusetts, brought them home. I put an ad on Craigslist. Piglets, $150 if you pay cash, $100 if you pay me in bullets, bullion, or Bitcoin. And that's how we did it, because one of the main things that we need to boycott now is the U.S. dollar. We need to boycott fiat, and we should all be trading in cryptocurrency, gold backs. If you don't know what gold backs are, they're amazing. You should. It's gold. It's the smallest denomination of gold I've ever seen. 1/1000th of an ounce. I used to advertise hay for a quarter a bale if you paid in pre-1964 silver coins. Back in the 2000s. And I actually sold hay for silver eagles to a couple of customers over the years. Anyways, Now Man Camp is a bunch of toddlers that come from the city. They come to our homestead, and these are kids from, like, there was a 4-month-old was the youngest one last week, and she's hanging on her mom while the mom's, helping us plant a garden. And we got kids up to 7 years old. There was like 22 of them here last Tuesday. And I got them harvesting forage, transporting it to the cows, and feeding them. So here's how that goes with a bunch of toddlers. Hey, guys, we got to rip up all this grass and weeds, throw it in these little red rider wagons, and then I have all the kids haul the cows over to the wagons about 1,000 foot away. Haul the wagons over to the cows about 1,000 foot away, and they feed the cows through the fence. They hand feed these calves. I got these Charolais calves and a couple of Jersey steers, and the kids feed them through the fence. So I bought those 250 piglets. I ended up wintering about 54 of them. I fenced off about 3 acres of heavy New Hampshire forest with an electric fence. Pigs are the easiest things to train in that electric fence. I used to run goats years ago, and pigs are like so easy to deal with compared to goats. Goats you can't keep in for some reason.
Hey,
anyway.
Mike, I'm sorry, jump in real quick, because I know Mike and the Naked Gardener have limited amount of time, so I wanted to make sure that we jumped on them really quick before. But you guys did something similar. I'm hearing Jay's story, and I'm thinking about you guys because you were in Arizona. You said we got to get out of here. We got to go back to Ohio, get some land, and then we're able to build this. Well, I mean, like an empire on YouTube, the Naked Gardener empire, of course, but more importantly, a garden and a farm, and now you've incorporated animals, and we get text messages when your chickens go missing and things like that. Yes. It's a whole thing. Like how you guys just jumped in there and did it. Did you have any sort of like farming background? Like what's your background that made you think you could pull this off?
Well, I'll let the Naked Gardener tell that story, but I followed her, and I followed her lead, and here I am on a homestead. But Naked Gardener, go ahead, please.
Yeah, we were, of course, living out in Arizona for a couple of years, but I really didn't have any hands-on prior experience. In fact, my earlier childhood, both of my grandparents gardened and farmed and had chickens and did all of that. But as a kid, I just played on the farm, played mostly with the stray cats that hung around, the barn cats. But that was it. It wasn't until much later on in my life when I started to show interest in all of this. And it started with my former mother-in-law, who actually built out some garden beds. And I started to, I felt that need to take care of those plants, keep them alive, because I was not really very familiar with that process. And so I had to learn that. And upon learning that, I fell in love with it. And I started to want to grow my own vegetables in my backyard. And I had a few raised garden beds, and that's just how I started. And I really just started to grow the things that I enjoyed to eat. And when we moved to Arizona, obviously living out in the desert, it was so dry, very hot, very difficult to grow anything. And I kind of tabled the whole garden stuff, and we really missed the greenery of the Midwest, which is, of course, where Mike and I were both originally from and grew up. So we actually decided to come back this way, and that was at the beginning of the pandemic. And we really wanted to do it differently, get some land, and start to grow our own food, become more self-sufficient. And really, it was for our own personal experience of that. And that is what I've been showcasing on my YouTube channel, The Naked Gardener, is just sharing our journey in doing this. Mostly it is, of course, myself that does a lot of the work, but Mike is a huge help when I certainly need it, because it has grown quite a bit in the few years that we've been here. Year one, I completely dove fully in and started to build everything out. And it was a lot of work, but a lot of fun. And I just enjoy this so much. And really, during the whole process of my living out in Arizona, and then, of course, coming back here and returning to this kind of environment, just shifted some things in me energetically and spiritually. And I just really started to develop a deeper relationship with nature. And it healed me in so many different ways, and continues to provide something for my soul that I know was lacking in my previous years. And so that is what I love to deliver in my messaging through my videos. That is actually the primary thing that I like to inspire, is cultivating that deeper relationship with nature and what that can do for you on an emotional, mental, physical level. I think we've gone so far from having that connection with the plants, with the earth, the soil, the sun, and how much our bodies and our minds need that. I think it's vital for us as a species to have that connection, and we've just gone so far from that. So since I have reconnected in that deeper way here, so much has shifted for me, and I hope to just inspire others to really do that as well. And of course, to show them that you don't have to necessarily do it on the big, large scale that I know some are talking about here today. Even if it is just growing food for yourself, your family, and just getting back into that that connection, that level of knowledge and wisdom that our species once had many, many, many moons ago. So I think it's just really important that we come back to that.
But hey, we learned some hard lessons, didn't we?
Oh, absolutely. It has certainly been quite the ride.
It's like you learn, like I grew up, I basically lived most of my life in the city. I work in IT. I like to think of myself as handy, but not as handy as I like to think I am. Like, pretty much the lesson here is, if there are unknowns with a project, double the cost and triple the amount of time that it's going to take to complete. If you dig a well, make sure you have the strength and the energy to complete the well, because the Naked Gardener documented our well digging attempt, and it didn't go as planned. There's going to be a lot of failures when you do things for the first time, especially homesteading. There's going to be failures, and be aware that you're going to have to manage your time differently, because the more projects you take on, the more animals you bring in, the more time is going to be occupied. So just keep that in mind, everyone.
I think it's important to set reasonable expectations, but also at the same time, you kind of are showing that you don't have to have a hardcore farming background to jump into this, and you can do it on a smaller scale and sort of grow it as you feel comfortable. And on top of that, I know we've done enough of these shows. You don't have to have a ton of land. You don't have to have as much land as you might think you need. And if you're somebody in the city, there's ways that you can grow food indoors. I'm sure I'd like to get Jim Gale to weigh in on this, since we're talking about feeding people in a limited amount of space, and we're talking about just maximizing what you've got. I mean, if there isn't, food forest abundance is doing that, right? That is what you do. 7 layers of food, right?
Yeah. Yes. I'm so glad to be. I love all you guys. This is just
we love you, Jimmy. We're so glad. Every time you come on, I want to run through a wall afterwards.
Wow. Everything we know about how to feed the world is freaking wrong. And everybody here knows that. And now we're bringing the solutions to the masses. We're now in 54 countries and 50 U.S. states, assisting people, inspiring people, empowering people, and encouraging people to take out the poisons and grow food instead of ornamental plants. And my experience, I'm not a farmer, and I don't know how to grow anything. I know how to design it, and I know how to build soil, and then I know how to put the plant in the ground, right? And then from there, nature, God does everything else. And I know our job is to inspire a shift in awareness that leads to mass adoption of this simple thing, and that's growing food instead of lawns without poisons. When we inspire that shift, we solve all of the world's major problems: mass extinction, deforestation, cancer, diabetes, heart disease. We end world hunger. We end tyranny when we create that cultural shift. So I've been asking the question obsessively for 15 years. How do we do that? And so we're doing everything in our power, which is what we can do to grow our power and to demonstrate what this is like. Right now at Galt's Landing, and I invite everybody, we're 45 minutes from the Orlando International Airport. Please come visit me. I would love to do a show with you from Galt's Landing and just show you what we're talking about. Because right now I can go outside. We've done the work. The work was up front. The design and the installation, the well we dug, the solar panels we put up, the automated system that takes water out of our pond. We put 14,000 fish in the pond, 7 species. We take that water on a solar pump and we fertigate the food forest on 4 different zones. When the clouds are down or out, the water system goes down. When the sun comes out, the water system blasts the plants. And somebody criticized me the other day, and I love that, by the way. Please bring it. And they said, a food forest is way more maintenance than you're letting on. So I went out into my food forest and I asked myself the question, what maintenance do I have to do in this food forest? And the instant answer was the only maintenance that we've done in 18 months in that particular set of syntropic rows was to mow the lawn in between the rows. That's all we've done. And it's massively productive. There's so many sweet potatoes in the ground that our only job now is to harvest the food and then to know how to cook it. And I don't know how to cook it, so I'm learning from experts that know how to cook. And that's going to be my next phase, is to go out and just harvest food. It's not free technically because it costs a lot of energy to put it in the ground. But now it's basically free forevermore, exponentially. So now I want to learn on film how to cook it and then show people how to take this from start to finish and to inspire this shift.
And actually, Lanny spends all of her time, I would think, learning how to preserve the food that she grows. And I've learned a lot from her. She does workshops on that. And I mean, it changed my life, actually, because it's the food is like the probiotics are in there and the food seems to last forever if you eat some of the stuff out of her fridge.
I'm just thinking about how I need to go to Jim's house just so I can ferment all the things that are growing there that don't grow here in my region in Northwest Washington.
Please come. I don't know how to do that real well either. So please.
Fermentation, canning, like other kinds of food preservation, drying meats naturally with, dry curing with salt. Things have been forgotten by our society. And I think it's extremely important for people to relearn these things that were once commonplace in every home. Once we were around people, adults in the home, doing these things on a daily basis. You were weird if you didn't know about that. It's totally reversed in just 50, 60 years. And I wasn't fortunate enough to grow up in a home that was growing things or raising chickens or producing their own food or even cooking from scratch. Although I thought we were cooking from scratch when I was a kid, but I have a different perception of what that means now. No more Betty Crocker cake mix. You're actually, maybe you're grinding your own flour now. You take it back a step each time, right? And for me, helping people relearn how to do these ancestral ways of preserving food has been really important, especially when more and more people get interested in growing their own food. You grow it, and then we have an off season. Most places have an off season when things aren't growing. And what are you eating then? If you're relying on the grocery store through those months and you're having waste during other times, then let's think how we can convert that energy by putting those things up when they're in season and then enjoying them throughout the year. So the shelf I can see here in my basement is still loaded with fruits and vegetables from last year's garden. And my 2 refrigerators are loaded with sauerkraut and kimchi and all the different kind of fermented pickles and dilly beans. And I'm over the moon for the natural process of fermentation. And that's what I love to share with people at my workshops and everything else I do for Greener Postures, which Monica came to. And you can attest that even with no real skills that you can just, put something in a jar with a little salt and watch it until it's ready to eat. And you have.
I only
ferments.
showed up because my husband wanted pickled green beans for Bloody Marys.
And you did
then,
it. You provide.
Yes, and now he's horrified by the fact that I eat sauerkraut for breakfast every day.
Now let's move to this next clip from the Indie News Network on the Nord Stream pipeline.
The Dossier, Jordan Schachtel. I subscribe to the Dossier. It provides me with an alternative view that I don't want to pull my hair out. He's not a lefty. He's not really. He is independent, but he certainly leans right. And I would guess that he is a Republican, though he bags on Trump pretty often. He puts out here about Mission Impossible, and I love this. This is actually finally someone who's debunking this nonsense that I can share. So on Nord Stream in Ukraine, the ruling class literally has no respect for your intelligence because this is Mission Impossible, the Ukrainian Navy Nord Stream Pipeline Edition. This is going to once again show the Washington Post has published a new report citing anonymous transatlantic intelligence sources. I can't even get through that sentence without laughing. Doubling down on the idea that Ukraine pulled off the Nord Stream pipeline sabotage attack without coordinating with a major global power in the process. Right?
Wrong.
Yeah, thanks. So you have the Discord leaks. The CIA in June 2022 learned that a team of Ukrainian Special Operations Forces intended to attack the Russia to Germany natural gas pipeline. It was sabotaged in September 2022. We know this.
I know who did it.
It was Joe Biden. He's the Nord Stream bomber. Yes.
No, you have any? No, it's Gladys White and the Orcas. The Orcas did it. Everybody, they've been
Gladys
doing it from
has
the
been
start.
awesome. All right, so Jordan put together a map detailing the route that would be required for Ukraine's Navy to sail from the war-torn port of Odessa to the areas where Nord Stream pipeline was sabotaged. The round-trip journey amounts to about 10,000 miles, which would be impossible to pull off undetected. Here's the route. They're going to start over here at the Black Sea. They're going to go all around the entire continent of Europe. They're going to go right there. I think that's next to Sicily there, between Sicily and Tunisia.
Ibiza should be right around there.
Right between Spain and Morocco.
No,
correct.
it's the other way.
The other way? Yep. All right. All the way up and around.
Like
totally undetected by anybody and end up all the way over there. And then go all the way back. Okay. Since
you
March.
got Italy's little boot hitting Crete.
Right? That's not. What?
Yeah.
Italy's little boot.
Italy's boot.
That's Sicily. That's Sicily right there. Not Crete. Crete's back there in Greece. Crete's back
Crete's
there.
the other little island.
Crete's back there.
Greece, Rome, same. They're the same.
Yeah, close enough. Croatia, we got this. Yes, Krebs got this. Krebs like Croatia, we got this. All right. Since March, the corporate media has been assisting the U.S. intel community in making the case that the Biden administration had nothing to do with the Nord Stream sabotage attack. Nothing to see here. Please disperse. The talking points first appeared in the New York Times, which claimed that an unnamed pro-Ukrainian group was said to be responsible for the September 2022 attack. The sources for this information remain nothing more than anonymous intelligence agents. Well, go figure. The transatlantic ruling classes are simply making a mockery. Yes, what? Are simply making a mockery of our ability to reason. Solid mockery. Given the ramifications that would come from admitting to authorizing such an attack, we can safely assume there will never be accountability from the Biden administration for this operation, but there will be plenty of additional storytelling to come. Yeah.
More stories.
More stories. So this was a short one. I did want to show this map because I think this map, it just, okay. Prove to me that the Ukrainian Navy could pull that off. Just that trip. Undetected. Let alone the charges and everything else that would have taken, plus having the equipment to do so, to pull that whole thing off. Totally undetected by Russia, which, by the way, also monitors shit that's happening right there in the Baltic Sea. They're not going to see a Ukrainian sub? Come on. Come on, man. Like, insulting. Dude, that's good. That's good. Shout out to the Gray Zone for getting that footage. So for those who don't know what that is, earlier this week, one of the Gray Zone reporters was did a walk and talk with Jamal Bowman as he's walking into Congress, asking him about Ukraine and funding for Ukraine and for
why do you fund the Ukraine war?
Putin's a madman.
That's why.
And he really didn't have very much else beyond that. Putin's a madman. So we got to stop him, and we got to stop him because he's a madman. Yep.
But he didn't know about the Crimea and the Donbass. He had no idea.
Well, see, the thing is, I actually think that he was fibbing because he didn't want to admit what he knew because he knew what he knew wasn't good. All right. So he just acted like he didn't know.
Always lying?
Pretty much. He acted like he didn't know anything about it. And it was like, okay, great. Thanks. Have a good day. And he just blew him off and walked in the building. Like, that's what I saw happening. I know a lot of people felt like he was really playing, like he really was dumb. I really feel like he was playing dumb. And he is well read in on exactly what we are doing, what Ukraine is doing, where we are, and the fact that we have not been doing nor winning like the media has been saying we are. And somehow Russia has not collapsed. Russia, well, ask our friend Fiorella. Has Russia collapsed? No, they really haven't. Actually, they've been better off kind of in some ways since this thing started. They're making deals with India. They're making deals with China. They've aligned with BRICS. They just went to a thing in South Africa. And yeah.
Ask them.
No, we don't want to ask them because what we'll find out is that we're the ones behind it.
Journalists, ask them the question.
Oh God. Oh, that is. I used to be such a fan. It's so sad. It really is.
Last but not least, let's look at this full clip from James Corbett testifying at the National Citizens Inquiry.
With episode 445 of the Corbett Report podcast, James Corbett testifies at the National Citizens Inquiry. And yes, this is not a trick title. You can tell from the title exactly what today's episode is. This is my testimony to the National Citizens Inquiry. Now, if you happened to miss my Solutions Watch on the National Citizens Inquiry that I released in April, in which I talked to the Volunteer Communications Director of the NCI, Michelle Leduc-Catlin, then you might not know what the National Citizens Inquiry is, what it does, what it is attempting to do. I would highly suggest you take a look at the aforementioned Solutions Watch episode if you are interested in the context for this testimony, so you know what kind of proceeding is happening here, and you can find links to watch the other proceedings, etc. Of course, that will be linked up in the show notes as well, so you can go to the National Citizens Inquiry website and see their various material, video streams, and other material about what they are doing. But in a nutshell, essentially this is, as it states, a National Citizens Inquiry into the Canadian government's declaration and response to the so-called scamdemic, the so-called pandemic, the scandemic, COVID mandates, the freedom protests, etc. So it is covering a lot of ground. It is talking to both experts and hearing from various witnesses in various technical capacities. It's also talking to people who have been affected, for example, by the clot shots, the forced medical interventions, and who have had their lives devastated by that. So, again, there's a lot of testimony that went on, and there will be a report released soon by the National Citizens Inquiry, so stay tuned for that update. But in the meantime, this is the testimony that I delivered on day 2 of the Ottawa hearings. Again, this was back a month ago, or a few weeks ago now anyway. And so I'm going to present my testimony. It involves some Q&A from the commissioners at the end. And I think that this is a nice, instructive bit of history / current events, both for those who have been following my work and know a little bit about the World Health Organization, the Pandemic Treaty, One Health Agenda, etc., but also, of course, to introduce people who don't know about these subjects. So rather than over-talking it, I'm simply going to present the testimony. Enjoy.
So I'd like to call our first witness of the day, who is joining us virtually from Japan. So James, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. I'll ask our AV person to turn your volume up a little bit. So I'd like to begin today by asking you to state your full name for the record, spelling your first and last name.
My name is James Corbett. That's James. Corbett, Corbett.
And James, do you promise to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Now, James, you are an independent journalist. You have the Corbett Report, which is an independent, listener-supported alternative news source, and it operates on the principle of open source intelligence. You've got a different history in your background, and I have to tell you that I've heard from several people comments about you that are just full of respect for the work that you do and the integrity of your research. So you come to us with a very good reputation, and we're pleased to have you join us today. And you are here to discuss with us some kind of global issues, like the Global Pandemic Treaty, the International Health Regulations, and One Health. And I'm just going to let you march into the presentation that you've prepared, and then we may have questions along the way and certainly afterwards.
Okay, excellent. Thank you for that. Thank you for inviting me here to talk about this. I think this is incredibly important, and in fact, in some ways goes to the heart of what all of the craziness of the past few years has really been about. So I hope I can do it justice. I do have a presentation prepared, but obviously please do interrupt and ask for clarification at any point you need to. In order to start in on these subjects, I think we need to establish some ground facts. And so it would help probably to know what is the World Health Organization. And for those who don't know, the World Health Organization was founded as a specialized agency of the United Nations in 1948, specifically to promote, quote, the attainment by all peoples of the highest possible level of health. And it proposes to achieve this task by acting as, quote, the directing and coordinating authority on international health work. All right, excellent. That sounds noble. It sounds like something that people could get behind, but as always, the devil is in the details. So some questions that might arise as we hear these words that come from the founding charter of the World Health Organization. What is health? And who determines the highest possible level of health, let alone how to attain it? And these aren't idle questions. As I know you know from the very impactful, harrowing testimony that you have heard over the course of this inquiry, the answers to those questions really do go to the heart of what we are facing, what we have seen over the past 3 years, certainly, and what we might see again in the future if we allow this to continue. Lockdowns, mandates, travel restrictions, forced medical interventions and procedures, and rule by decree of governmental or presumed health authorities. So this is an extremely important subject, and I just want to lay that out before we start diving into the details, because although the worst of the COVID hysteria may or may not be behind us, I think the real battle is only now beginning, and that battle is a battle over the definition of and the declaration of and the ability to govern over the next, quote unquote, the next pandemic, which we are constantly assured is right around the corner. So this is an incredibly important issue. So today I want to talk about two separate but related processes that are taking place under the auspices of the World Health Organization. One is, well, it's being referred to officially as the WHO Convention, Agreement, or other international instrument on pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response, which is a very, very long roundabout way of not saying Global Pandemic Treaty, but they, I think, specifically do not call this a pandemic treaty because the word treaty brings with it certain legal obligations and would require ratification by legislatures, at least in those states where they have constitutional procedures for governing this signing treaties. But conventions and agreements are covered under the WHO Constitution itself, which grants the governing body of the World Health Organization, the World Health Assembly, the power to, quote, adopt conventions or agreements with respect to any matter within the competence of the organization, which, when ratified, will oblige each member of the WHO, which, for the record, is almost every nation state on Earth, of course, Canada, no exception there, would oblige them to adopt those conventions or to notify the WHO's Director General of rejection of those or reservations to those stipulations within 18 months. So that's kind of the framework for why it is not being called a global pandemic treaty. But at any rate, this treaty, in all but name, is being drafted behind closed doors right now. This process has been going on for the better part of a year now, and is expected to be unveiled with an agreement or other instrument at the 77th World Health Assembly, which will be taking place next May. In the meantime, they are having closed-door briefings and sessions that are not open to the public, in which they are negotiating the text of this document. There is an entire bureaucracy that has been set up to handle this process of the drafting of this not a treaty, called the INB, the Intergovernmental Negotiating Body. And that has held, I believe, a couple of hearings now for public input into this process. But all that means is that accredited institutions and organizations that get permission can zoom in and basically make a short presentation about their feelings about what the treaty should include. Very few people given a chance, of course, to speak out against the process itself. And I think that's instructive in and of itself. But the meat of the negotiations of this draft treaty are taking place behind closed doors, and there is very little transparency on this process. So we do have a zero draft of this treaty that was unveiled earlier this year, and that we can at least see the text that they started with from ground zero, which gives us some insight into this process. It includes increased tools for epidemiological genomic surveillance and integrated One Health surveillance systems, which might raise the question, what does any of that mean? And those are good questions, but unfortunately not ones you will find the answers to in this zero draft of the treaty, because in the definitions section of the zero draft, you will note that, for example, it says under definitions, One Health surveillance means ... And then, of course, that's left blank because they have not come up with a definition of One Health surveillance yet, but it is included in the text of this zero draft. They talk about the need for integrated One Health surveillance systems without telling you what One Health surveillance means. Other such things like that abound in this document. There are obligations for member states to, quote, tackle false, misleading, misinformation, or disinformation. And I think given the events of the past few years, we know exactly what that looks like and what form that takes. As someone who had his YouTube channel of nearly 600,000 subscribers scrubbed for daring to talk about such things as the philosophy of science and other things related to the events that are going on, I know firsthand what that legalese text implies. The zero draft also includes verbiage about control over when, where, and how a pandemic is declared within each member state's borders. So it says, quote, the INB is encouraged to conduct discussions on the matter of the declaration of a pandemic by the WHO Director General under the WHOCA+, which is what they're calling this not a treaty, and the modalities and terms for such a declaration, including interactions with the international health regulations and other relevant mechanisms and instruments, end quote. So, yes, even the process by which a pandemic will be declared by the World Health Organization under this new treaty, or whatever they're calling it, is left open to negotiation. And again, negotiations which we do not have access to as lowly members of the public, who will simply be subjected to whatever rules end up getting forced into this document. I think that should be concerning in and of itself. But actually, it's in some ways maybe even worse than most people realize, because at least at this point, the World Health Organization does not officially declare a pandemic to have started or over. There is no official declaration of pandemic. There is an official declaration of a public health emergency of international concern, a PHEIC, which is a different declaration altogether. People might have heard recently that the WHO has declared the pandemic over, but that's not quite true, as even the fact checkers will, in this case, correctly tell you, no, they declared the end of the public health emergency of international concern, but they did not say that the pandemic is over. So this document is at least putting on the table the possibility of literally a declaration of pandemic by the WHO Director General in particular, which is interesting for reasons that relate to that PHEIC. But let's delve into the other side of this, because as it says in that text talking about this rule of the WHO Director General declaring a pandemic, and it says including interactions with the international health regulations, and that is the other document that I want to talk about
you
today.
Go there,
so
James,
one is this treaty, which they are not calling a treaty. The other is amendments to the
James,
international health
can I just slow you
regulation.
down for a sec before you go to the international health regulations?
Sure.
It's because some of the people that will be watching your testimony today, this will be brand new. So you're basically saying that we should be calling this a global pandemic treaty, what they're negotiating, but even the title, they're using words to kind of confuse so that we don't understand what it is, and that this is being negotiated behind closed doors, so it's not a public process. Is that right?
That is correct in substance. Obviously, it's my supposition that the unwieldy title contributes to the confusion around this process, but it is not supposition that the word treaty is specifically brings with it certain legal obligations that I think are being obviously avoided in this lengthy appellation.
And then I just want people to understand, so when you're saying definitions are left blank, when laws are drafted or treaties are drafted, they'll actually put a definition in and then start using those words. So the definition is very, very, very important. So when James is saying, well, One Health surveillance, which sounds very Orwellian, or One Health surveillance system, saying these terms are being used. So they have a specific meaning, but the text that's been released, they're not telling us what the meaning is. So I just want people to understand how important that point is that James has brought up, is it makes it impossible for us reviewing the text that has been released to really understand the significance. And I can tell you, having drafted legislation for government, that when you actually already have a term, you have a definition in mind. Like, you know what that term means. You're not throwing it in there for good measure. So to me, that's quite concerning what you've brought up. And just slow this down before you move on, is you're telling us there's actually provisions in there to deal with misinformation. So they're already anticipating censoring information that goes against what they say?
That is certainly the implication. There is no language, at least in the zero draft that's been provided to the public, to specifically say how member states are committing to tackling false, misleading misinformation or disinformation. But I think we've seen exactly how that has been done over the past few years, including direct governmental interference in social media, for example, but actively censoring people who go against the pronouncements of any declared public health authority. So I think that's essentially what is being declared. But specifically, it's from Article 17, Paragraph 1. The parties commit to increase science, public health, and pandemic literacy in the population, as well as access to information on pandemics in their efforts, and tackle false, misleading, misinformation, or disinformation, including through promotion of international cooperation which is an interesting addition. And just to clarify, yes, Chapter 1, the introduction, Article 1, definition and use of terms, they do have in the zero draft 4 of the terms defined, but they leave pathogen with pandemic potential, One Health approach, One Health surveillance, infodemic, interpandemic, current health expenditure, universal health coverage, and recovery are all left undefined at this point.
Interesting. Okay, sorry for interrupting. Please continue.
Valuable things to elaborate on. All right, so let's talk about the other process that is going on. And I think, again, supposition, this is another part of the deliberately confusing nature of this process. In addition to this treaty, or whatever they're calling it, there is a proposal to amend the international health regulations. So what are the international health regulations? Back in 1951, the World Health Assembly, the governing body of the WHO, adopted the International Sanitary Regulations, which was an attempt to consolidate the multiple and overlapping international agreements that then pertained governing quarantine procedures and other international health controls that were at that time a series of bilateral deals between various countries, and that was quite confusing, obviously, for an increasingly globalized society, international trade, etc. So that was consolidated into this international sanitary regulations. And in that was ultimately turned into the International Health Regulations in 1969, and those IHR, International Health Regulations, were amended in 1973 and 1981. At that time, the entirety of the International Health Regulations covered specifically 6 diseases, but specifically focused on 3 of them: cholera, yellow fever, and plague. But after the SARS-1 hysteria of 2003, there was a push for amendment and sweeping reform of these IHR, International Health Regulations, to take into account the new and novel diseases that could appear in the future. So that push led to the adoption of the last round of amendments to the IHR in 2005. So that is the most recent edition of the International Health Regulations, and that was the edition of the International Health Regulations that introduced that aforementioned public health emergency of international concern, which is a specific declaration that is made ultimately by the Director General of the World Health Organization, although supposedly, theoretically, there is an independent advisory board that advises the Director General whether or not to declare a public health emergency of international concern for any emerging virus or pandemic or what have you. And that independent advisory board really, according to what I think the drafters, or at least what was presented to the public, it was the advisory board that's ultimately making this decision, and the Director General just gives the rubber stamp to their recommendation. Of course, that turned out not to be the case with the declaration of the monkeypox public health emergency of international concern last year, in which we, according to reports, apparently the Director General, Tedros, broke the deadlock in the advisory panel by declaring that it was a public health emergency of international concern. And it's interesting that it's even portrayed as a deadlock when, in fact, the majority of the independent advisory board recommended against declaring a PHEIC. But what is a PHEIC? Why is it important? What does it do? It essentially, the declaration of public health emergency of international concern opens up a number of powers for the World Health Organization to up to and including, as was reported back in the mid-2000 teens during the Ebola public health emergency of international concern. It was reported even in Newsweek and other places that the powers that are unlocked by such a declaration could even include, conceivably, NATO boots on the ground in order to enforce quarantines or deliver medical aid or intervention or what have you. So this is a significant declaration. And of course, it also brings into effect a number of contracts that are signed for various governments that ultimately obligate them to purchase prophylactics, including vaccines or whatever else may be available for the declared health emergency. And that became a significant factor in the first ever declaration of a PHEIC back in 2009 during the swine flu pandemic, which ultimately ended up being a less deadly flu season than regular. But that being what it is, the declaration of PHEIC obligated countries around the world, including, of course, in Canada, to purchase swine flu vaccines that ultimately a lot of them ended up getting destroyed, but unused. But whatever, at any rate, it was there, and an awful lot of money was made on the back of those vaccines. And an independent investigation from the Council of Europe the following year, as well as a British medical journal investigation, found that there were serious conflicts of interest between the independent advisory board that advised then WHO Director General Margaret Chan to declare that PHEIC and the very pharmaceutical manufacturers who ended up benefiting from that declaration. So that's kind of the context of this international health regulations and what's on the table. This current round of negotiations for further amendments to those IHR include a grab bag of proposals of potential amendments. And so some of the ones that pop out immediately include the idea of striking out the words, quote, full respect for the dignity, human rights, and fundamental freedoms of persons from the IHR principles. Giving WHO greater authority over surveillance, monitoring, and control of health threats, including greatly expanding the PHEIC power, with proposals suggesting giving the Director General the authority to declare not a public health emergency of international concern, but an intermediate public health alert, where a public health event does not actually reach the threshold of declaration of PHEIC, but quote, requires heightened international awareness and preparedness activity. So whatever that means. Granting the WHO the power of a global emergency health legislature, including, quote, proposals to potentially change the currently non-binding and standing recommendations on medical and or non-medical countermeasures to address a PHEIC that the Director General shall issue to WHO member states after consultation into binding recommendations. So they are actually proposing to change that wording from non-binding to binding, which ultimately does make the WHO into a de facto government, at least public health emergency legislature. It includes proposals for working with partners to establish a global digital health certification network, which is intended to enable member states to verify the authenticity of vaccination certificates issued under IHR, as well as other health documents, and proposals to expand the scope of the international health regulations to cover not just demonstrable ongoing public health emergencies, but, quote, all risks with a potential to impact public health. In other words, this is an astounding power grab that is, again, represented in these two parallel processes, the treaty that they're not calling a treaty and the international health regulations amendments that are separate processes that are being run by separate governing bodies, but that, as the WHO states, could overlap. And there are meetings that, again, are going on behind closed doors as to whether or how these two processes should merge, or maybe there should be two separate processes. Maybe they should continue with one of them but not the other. It's all left completely opaque at the moment. So those are the two processes. And in order to understand, I think, what's really on the table, we have to understand the overall idea behind, the concept of public health in general and where it is going in the future. I'll pause for a moment in case you need any further clarification on anything I've presented so far, though.
And actually, that's a perfect time for a pause. It's interesting. We had a witness yesterday, Denis Rancourt. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he's a physicist by training, but had been a full professor for years at University of Ottawa and an interdisciplinary researcher. And he's presented on all-cause mortality using Canadian and U.S. data. And one of the points he brought up a couple of times was in the past when pandemics were declared, be that, avian flu or swine flu or whatever, that there was no indication in all-cause mortality that there was ever a pandemic. So in other words, you couldn't see it, but he says you could see, a heat wave for 3 days. That would show up, other things would show up, but actually that every single time a pandemic had been declared, that there was no rise in all-cause mortality, and so basically the implication is being that these pandemics are declared when there is no public health emergency, and here you are telling us that basically countries like Canada would lose their sovereignty, so that if a pandemic was declared by the World Health Organization, that we would have no choice but to allow them to basically counter some pandemic. Are we hearing you correctly about that?
Member states are already obligated to do a number of things under the WHO Constitution, including implementing the conventions and agreements that are decided upon by the World Health Assembly. So really, there are already obligations that are in place for Canada, as we've seen, I think, through the course of the past few years, let alone decades. That in fact, for example, there is a stipulation in the existing international health regulations that all countries have to comply and to actively assess their compliance with the international health regulations and pandemic preparedness generally. And so Canada, as you may or may not know, actually, the government of Canada posts on their website occasionally their updates as to their self-assessment of their compliance with the international health regulations. So there are already stipulations in place. I think the proposed amendments just give the potential for these obligations to expand.
It's interesting. So that explains why, it seems that most of the world, certainly the Western world, followed kind of one plan. And what I've always found interesting is and this is just my thinking, but let's say we were facing a serious threat by, a virus, and, we've got to figure out what to do. It would seem to me you'd actually want different countries trying different things so that you could see what works and allow, different theories to be tested. But we basically have entered a world where one organization has the power to decide how we deal with a serious threat, and if they get it wrong, then the whole world will face the consequences of that. Because that's the flip side. If they get it right, well, great, all's well and off we go. But if they get it wrong, it means that the catastrophe is magnified. Do you have any? But basically, that's where we're at legally.
I concur wholeheartedly. I think that gets actually to the real heart of the philosophical issue, let alone the legal issue that we're facing here, which is the question of the centralization of power over public health in fewer and fewer hands. And in fact, that's kind of how I'm planning to end this presentation. But perhaps we should cover One Health before.
Sure. Can I just ask one more thing? Because you just went over it quickly. You were saying they were striking out some principles, something. Can you just read that text slower for us? I think it's important for us to understand. So there's principles in the current international health regulations. So it means principles, just so that people hearing your testimony understand. They're supposed to be what guides the interpretation and application of these regulations. So they're kind of fundamental to what our goals are. But please share with us what is being removed or being proposed to be removed as a principle.
Yes. So the text that is being proposed to be struck out from the Article 3, which is the principles of the IHR document, is, quote, with full respect for the dignity, human rights, and fundamental freedoms of persons. And that the proposed alternate text, again, people can find this on the WHO's own website. They have a post of the proposed amendments. The proposed alternate text, instead of with full respect for the dignity, human rights, and fundamental freedoms of persons, is based on the principles of equity, inclusivity, coherence, and in accordance with their common but differentiated responsibilities of the state's parties, taking into consideration their social and economic development. I will let you parse that for yourself. But anyway,
I think what they want to George Orwell would be proud of that one. So, okay.
I concur. Yeah.
So, please continue this. And I can just share with you that I believe we're all everyone is finding this very interesting, and we haven't had somebody speak to us about these issues. So we certainly appreciate you sharing with us.
All right. So what we have heard so far, I think, is fairly concerning, but actually where I think this is going demonstrably is even more concerning. And what this is raising the specter of is the concept of the One Health approach or One Health agenda, which is being adopted by many different health authorities in many different countries. The CDC in the United States, the World Health Organization is talking about it. In fact, there's an entire institutional framework that's taking shape around it. One Health, that phrase was apparently coined in the wake of the SARS-1 events back in 2003, 2004, to discuss the threat of emerging diseases emerging from animal populations and the contact of animal and human populations, so zoonotic diseases. And that concept started to come on board, that public health is not just about your individual health as a human being. It is about the health of, well, nature, including animals. So the CDC, for example, defines One Health, the One Health approach, as, quote, a collaborative, multi-sectoral and transdisciplinary approach working at the local, regional, national, and global levels with the goal of achieving optimal health outcomes, recognizing the interconnection between people, animal, plants, and their shared environment. So again, I think like the founding principles and definitions in the World Health Organization Charter, this is language that is designed to sound very appealing, but I think quite quickly starts to get into some very interesting philosophical areas, shall we say. So I think we have to recognize what is being done here is a rhetorical move to essentially make every corner of the globe, every natural resource, every plant, every animal, every person, including every person, as part of an interconnected web that forms this new definition of public health, One Health. And so embedded within this idea, within this concept, is if we have a centralized, specialized agency of the UN, like the World Health Organization, which is in charge of coordinating international public health, well, we need some sort of centralized control that will have jurisdiction essentially over every one of these constituent elements, every habitat, every resource, every animal, every plant, and every person, in order to coordinate not public health, but international One Health. So I think we see where this is starting to go. And of course, it doesn't just involve the World Health Organization. Again, by its very nature, this is such a broad concept that it applies to every nook and cranny of every bureaucratic infrastructure in at least the UN panoply. As evidenced by the fact that the World Health Organization has just joined a quadripartite coalition consisting of the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, bringing in that food concept that was referred to by Catherine Austin Fitts, the United Nations Environment Program, bringing in the specter of, well, the Rio Summit and UNFCCC and the IPCC, etc. The World Organization for Animal Health and the World Health Organization have now combined forces to tackle this One Health approach idea, and they have set up a new high-level expert panel, quote unquote, to coordinate activities on One Health, which is defined as an integrated, unifying approach that aims to sustainably balance and optimize the health of people, animals, and ecosystems. So, again, this sounds laudable, but it is predicated on a devaluing of human life in or equity, which I guess we're supposed to assume is always, and in every context, a wonderful word, equity with nature. So humans have to be devalued to the point where we do not prioritize human health over the health of, say, an animal species or something along those lines. And I think people understand where that concept is going or where it could go. But at any rate, that is the One Health approach that is now being fostered under the auspices of not just the WHO, but a number of international organizations.
So that's how we end up locked down in 15-minute cities and eating crickets.
Unfortunately so, or at least I believe that is part of the plan. So yes, as you indicate there, this is not just about the concept of health as we tend to think of it, as in you feel sick and you go to the doctor and you get some medicine or something along those lines, it has to do with every aspect of your life. Where you live, how you live, what you eat, et cetera, et cetera. There's really, it would be difficult to think of any aspect of your life that would not come under the purview of this One Health idea.
That's quite striking, actually. So did you have more to share?
I can talk about the next steps in this process. So with regards specifically to the international health regulations, again, they are being proposed to be adopted at the 77th World Health Assembly next May by a simple majority vote. And so given the scope of the constitution of the WHO, and specifically Article 21, the amendments of the IHR, when and if they are adopted, will come into force within all member states within 12 months of adoption, unless a state proactively files rejections or reservations within a 10-month period after the adoption. So at any rate, this is a very, very short timetable. And I think that's, again, to the momentum is on the side of the bureaucratic meddlers here, shall we say. As regards to the treaty that they're not calling a treaty, that would require, I think there are different interpretations of this, but I have read that it would require a 2/3 majority vote in the World Health Assembly, with each member state being able to sign and ratify the treaty in accordance with their own domestic laws. But, as I say, I think the World Health Organization Constitution, as it is written, is interpretable in ways that would suggest that any World Health Organization member state is obligated to enact whatever convention or agreement is signed. So, again, I think that there are different legal opinions of what this is, but I think we have a very narrow window in which to act. And I guess the question for Canadians is, what can be done or what should be done? So I guess on the most basic legal political level, obviously, given the fact that a formal registration of concern is required to at least stop this from being automatically implemented in Canada within 1 year of its adoption, then obviously I think politically people's energies should be directed in that direction, at least at this moment. And there are movements afoot in a number of different countries right now, not only attempting to preventatively get their member states out of this process for the negotiation, but actually to withdraw from the WHO altogether. And I note that there was a press conference on the steps of the U.S. Capitol just this week involving several U.S. congressmen. I heard 21 of them actually were there, demanding a complete withdrawal of the United States from the World Health Organization. So that is, I think, at least a sign of the type of political movement that could be happening if people were engaged and aware on these issues, although obviously the Canadian political context may be a little bit different than the American context. And I think one thing that we could be assured of is that the establishment media would ignore or denigrate such a political movement to the extent that they acknowledged it at all, in the exact same way as they did with the Freedom Convoy. But more to the point, I think, perhaps more hopefully, I see the formation of communities of interest, public and private membership associations, and other organizations forming on the basis of the principle that human beings have natural bodily autonomy, and medical interventions cannot be enforced or forced upon anyone against their will. And so I think the idea of people coming together on that basis, including doctors and other medical professionals and regular people coming together on that basis to form their own sort of splinter medical system, to me seems the more thoroughgoing approach here, not recognizing the diktats of centralized health authorities. However, obviously, nothing is going to change unless and until there is a widespread recognition among Canadians and people all over the world of the fundamental underlying issue. What is health, and who gets to define that word? Who gets to describe what a health crisis is and what states, let alone individuals, must do in the event of a declared health crisis? These are the fundamental questions, and who controls those powers? Which really raises, I think, the fundamental underlying question of all of this. Because what I've been describing with regards to these powers that are coming into view might raise the specter of medical martial law, essentially times of suspension of regular law in which health authorities essentially act as martial authorities, being able to dictate law into law just by saying it, which is exactly what we saw over the past few years. But I think it's even worse than that. What we are seeing is the erection of an infrastructure for a new paradigm of governance, the biosecurity state. And if you are unfamiliar with the writings of Giorgio Agamben, he is a famed and noted Italian philosopher who has been writing about this subject for the past few years. I highly recommend his work, including an article he wrote in March of 2020 called Biosecurity and Politics, where he identified this as the crux of the issue. He wrote, "The total organization of the body of citizens in a way that strengthens maximum adherence to institutions of government, producing a sort of superlative good citizenship in which imposed obligations are presented as evidence of altruism, and the citizen no longer has a right to health safety, but becomes juridically obliged to health, biosecurity." And I think that is the specter of what we are facing, the imposition of medical interventions in the name of health. But essentially, it's a new paradigm of governance that we are looking at. And so I think we need to fundamentally question the need for health authorities, centralized control over the medical system, rather than the idea that people can choose for themselves what medical interventions and what medical precautions they are willing to take or not take. And also the acknowledgement that with our fundamental right of bodily autonomy comes with it our right to essentially ignore and to go against the outward imposition of dictates and obligations by any presumed health authority. So any treaty, any convention, any international health regulations that are signed that do not recognize fundamentally informed medical consent.
James, I'm just going to step in if you let me.
Null and void.
Okay. So it's interesting. So you're telling us stuff, and I've just kind of, when I do have time to see non-mainstream media, you hear about international health regulations and that this is going on. But I can tell you personally, I've not heard this type of detail that you're providing. So basically, Canada is, walking into the situation where really our entire sovereignty could be given up in the name of this, One Health initiative, where our everything from our food supply to our complete medical system to our freedoms could be dictated from an outside source. That's basically what's happening, and we're not hearing anything about it.
Yes, I think it is already happening, and yes, we are not hearing about it.
Are you aware of a single, group or anyone that is on this issue in Canada that should be given some support or we could be directed to?
There are a number of individuals and independent media that are talking about these issues, but in terms of actual coordinated political movement on this front, I don't know. As I say, I live in Japan, so I am not in touch with any particular group.
No, I was just asking because if you're not aware of one, then perhaps that there's a need that needs to be filled here, and that's important for us to know. Also, it's interesting. I just as the National Citizens Inquiry has been moving about province to province, I ended up being out for dinner with some of the people involved in the NCI, including local organizers in Vancouver for supper. And, sitting to my left was a person from Quebec that lives on a fairly sizable acreage who is telling me that his chickens have to be registered and he's only allowed 3 chickens. And then somebody living on a farm in BC is saying, I have to register every cow, every sheep, every chicken, like that, the amount of control. And then I have a personal friend in Alberta who's, being told that, well, any water body, they have to have a fence this size, and that would include their rain barrel. Like, it's just, there's all of a sudden this micromanagement of rural properties and animals being imposed from above, which makes zero sense unless there is a effort to basically have total control over, food supply and animals and rural properties. And it sounds like this would be connected.
I think it is. But on that note, I think that the pushback that we're seeing from Alberta, from Saskatchewan, the Alberta Sovereignty Act, or whatever these things are being called, which I'm not following the passage of these bills closely, but I understand, would essentially be a declaration of the provincial government's right to exclude federal authorities from butting in on their jurisdiction, which, of course, health is actually a provincial jurisdiction, not federal.
Right. Okay. I'm going to turn you over to the commissioners to see if the commissioners have questions, and they do.
Good morning, and thank you for coming and providing your testimony. We're completed 22 days of testimony across the country at the NCI right now, and it's like a large jigsaw puzzle that seems to be coming together. And when I was listening to your testimony, it reminded me of some testimony I think we had in Vancouver. And one of the witnesses held up a document that they said was prepared by Theresa Tam, and what it was is that the climate emergency was the biggest threat to human health in Canada. And I kind of wondered about that, but are you aware of that document, and does that kind of fit in with this whole WHO control on pandemics that you're talking about?
I am not familiar with that document in particular, but I am certainly aware of many pronouncements along those lines that have been made over the past few years. And I certainly do see that as absolutely a fundamental part of the One Health agenda. I think the preparation of the public for the idea of a climate crisis, climate emergency, and ultimately lockdowns on the basis of such an emergency has been foreseen, has been talked about, has been openly written about by a number of people and institutions, the World Economic Forum and others, for years now. And so I definitely see that as part of the unfolding One Health agenda.
And I forgot to mention, and I don't know whether she still is, but I know she was, Theresa Tam was the head of one of the WHO health committees. I can't quite recall which one it was, but I believe it just started a few years ago. And again, I don't recall whether she's still the head of that or not, but it goes right along with what you're saying. We had another witness in, I think it was Vancouver, and she was an expert in international law and human rights. And in her testimony, she had demonstrated how Canada, during the pandemic, had violated or allegedly violated a number of the human rights which are guaranteed under the UN treaties, underneath a number of health treaties. And it's just interesting then how these human rights guaranteed under similar documentation by the UN are being trampled on by the healthcare directives that are being contemplated or being implemented by the WHO through the UN. Are you aware of that contradiction between human rights treaties and what you're talking about here, the proposed WHO?
Yes, in a sense, but I think that the legal documents and constitutions and other things that presumably we are ruled by, or that it constitutes the rule of law, are not really worth the paper that they're written on, generally speaking. And in fact, that's, of course, I would say exactly what we've seen over the evisceration of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms over the past few years. In fact, Giorgio Agamben, who I mentioned earlier, wrote an entire book about states of exception, talking about that issue and exploring it from the philosophical and jurisprudence and historical angle, that there is always a moment of aporia in these constitutional documents that essentially allow for the declaration of some sort of emergency that says all the rules are aside. And I would note specifically with regards to the United Nations and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that it propounds, they all sound wonderful and woolly until you get to Article 29, paragraph 3, which says these rights and freedoms may in no case be exercised contrary to the purposes and principles of the United Nations. So essentially, yes, you can have all these wonderful rights unless and until the United Nations says you can't, and then you can't. So I think those are the types of legal trickery that are played in these documents.
Well, I think that's why you rightly pointed out definitions and the grab bag of words that were in definitions, and Canadians, if they aren't, should be very much aware of how their constitutional rights or their Charter of Rights and Freedoms was completely neutralized by what seemed to be innocuous words, high-minded words. I mean, if we're not aware of those things now and scared to death about these definitions that go on and on and on and could mean anything, I mean, but it seems to me that you're saying that this is a common practice that they put in these kinds of words. They can manipulate any way they wish.
I think that is the case. As I say, I would definitely direct you to Agamben on that issue. He has written extensively about this, and it is demonstrable in a number of documents. And there is, generally speaking, some sort of emergency clause or an emergency act, public order emergency, for example, that can be declared that will suspend basic constitutional rights.
The last thing, when I was listening to your presentation and also listening to some comments made by Mr. Buckley, it reminded me of what's happened so many times in the past. I mean, in Soviet Russia, they got a hold of the food production, and they murdered or starved to death 20 million Ukrainians. I can't remember what the number is. They argue about what that number is. In China, they did the same thing during the late 1950s and early 1960s, and they took control out of all of the food production. And are we seeing that same thing happening today in Canada and in the Western world, but more importantly, at least to me, in Canada?
I would say anyone who isn't paying attention to the consolidation of the food supply in the hands of fewer and fewer corporate interests, but also governed over by a international institutional infrastructure, the Food and Agricultural Organization and other associated institutions. If you're not concerned by that process, then you're probably not paying attention. And in fact, the consolidation is getting worse and worse as we step forward into the Great Food Reset, which has been declared, and that involves such things as lab-grown meat to try to cut down on the horrible pollution that we know that actual regular farming and ranching are wreaking on our environment, except for a recent report that I may or may not throw any kind of spanner in those works, that apparently the lab-grown meat will be 25 times more energy and resource intensive than regular farming. I wonder if that will in any way derail the plans. But at any rate, this is definitely a part again of that One Health agenda and that One Health approach, and the consolidation of the food supply in the hands of a few corporations cannot be ultimately for the benefit of all humanity. There is, at the most basic level, a very obvious financial incentive for corporations to do this. But from the perspective of people who are literally thinking about trying to manage the human population in general, there could be no greater choke point for doing that than by controlling and manipulating and rationing the food supply.
Historically speaking, except for a handful of people at the top, some of those names that we know, central planning, state Soviet-style planning has never been successful. I mean, have we not learned our lesson in history? I mean, the 20th century was predicted to be the century of mass control. There were a number of books written in the late 1800s about that. And have we not learned our lesson? We had a witness yesterday who we talked about the definition of fascism, and these are not their words; these are my words. They're talking about us going into fascism on steroids, because in the past they never had the technological and electronic control and brainwashing that we have today. I mean, have we not? Will we not learn our lessons from history?
Unfortunately, it doesn't seem so. And actually, history would give us the proper terminology for this, because people are grasping around for historical precedents and political analogs, and they talk about fascism, they talk about communism. What they should be talking about is technocracy. And that was a movement that was quite popular in the United States and in Canada in the 1930s. And in fact, Elon Musk's Canadian grandfather was a prominent member in the Canadian technocratic political movement, who ultimately ended up fleeing Canada and going to South Africa, but that's another story. But technocracy was an idea that was predicated on the idea not of a fascist system, not a communist system, but the control of society, the engineering of society at a scientific and technical level by technical experts who would decide, who would calculate the entire energy inputs and outputs of the entire economy and base the economy around that calculation. And they would issue energy credits to the people who would then use those energy credits to purchase items. And that was a truly bizarre and crazy idea in the 1930s, because it would have required systems for continuously monitoring and surveilling every transaction in the entire economy in real time, which of course didn't exist in the 1930s. That technology exists now, and although the historical technocratic movement in Technocracy Inc., which was one of its products, has, well, not exactly disappeared, but is certainly not a prominent political part. But I think that ideology is still around, and that really starts to explain some of the directions that we're heading. For example, the concept of carbon rationing and the concept of universal basic income and some of these other concepts that are floating around are at base technocratic ideas that have been adapted and adopted for the terminology that appeals to us in the 21st century. But I think if we don't understand that history and where that idea developed from, I think we will basically not truly be able to understand what is happening until it's too late.
Well, yeah, I mean, we now have state-sponsored euthanasia. We have the state holding back life-saving medical procedures from a lady who testified yesterday because she wouldn't comply with something, a procedure that had nothing to do with the transplant. We have state-based racism, where they're pitting every different group of people against each other, regardless of what measure you want to look at. We have unprecedented propaganda 24 hours a day. People are acting like cyborgs, where they carry a device in their pocket, and they think because it's not under their skin, they're not a cyborg. But they, even in this room, we hear the phones ringing and beeping and clinking and clanging. I mean, this is from what I understand from you, and I understand from some of the other witnesses, this is at an unprecedented level of control, and therefore it's at an unprecedented. We as a race, as a human race, are at an unprecedented risk to their will. Is that not? Can you comment on that statement?
Yes, let me underline and underscore exactly what you're saying there. For any of the commissioners who do not know about it, I would wholeheartedly exhort you to look into Policy Horizons Canada, which is an arm of Canadian government that a few years ago produced a document on biodigital convergence, which talks exactly about what you're talking about, ultimately towards the creation of that cyborg intermediate species, that whatever we are becoming with this increasing adoption of technology, where they actually talk about the ways that at the medical level we will be more and more merged with machines. And again, you have to read this document in its own words. Don't take my word for it. But one of the things that they talk about in the document is the breakdown of the philosophy of vitalism, which is the idea that there is actually a real and meaningful distinction between organic life and inorganic matter. And they say that those lines are blurring because now people and animals and plants are engineerable, and we can put various biomechanical devices inside of them, and we can tinker and alter them. So the actual distinction between life and non-life is beginning to break down, and that they, I believe, frame that in a positive context in their documents. So yes, these are some very fundamental questions that we're facing. This agenda is really much more than simply public health. I think this is about the real question of the definition of human. What does it mean to be human? What is the value of human life itself? And obviously, it does raise the specter of eugenics and other really terrible ideas from history. And ultimately, I think you could trace it back to Malthus and the fundamental Malthusian idea that there are too many people, and that we must get rid of some portion of the population so that we can continue to live. Those fundamental philosophical wrong turns, I would say, continue to haunt humanity, and that is the direction in which I think all of this institutional momentum is heading.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much for your testimony today. It's been a while since I studied international law, a number of decades, I guess, back in law school. But my understanding was always that international law isn't really a set of rules that are imposed on countries, but it's more a set of agreements that countries reach with each other about how they're going to behave both with each other and internally. And so I guess with that framework in mind, and thinking about the treaty that you've talked about today and the international health regulations, should we be thinking about these documents and these amendments to these as things that really Canada is signing up to be binding and to be bound by? Or should we really be looking at these as something that maybe just will give our politicians legal cover for if they want to implement things that maybe aren't in the best interests of Canadians, but that they can then turn to and say, well, but it's the law, we've signed up to this?
There is absolutely an element of that, and I think the underlying principle that we have to understand here is that, exactly right, there is nothing that would stop Canada from tomorrow declaring we are not part of the World Health Organization and making it so by fiat. It can be done, and of course there is actually a process for withdrawing from the World Health Organization, etc. But what would happen if Canada just simply declared themselves to be out of the World Health Organization? Well, then by decree, it could essentially be manifested in reality, because, as you say, there is no international court that could adjudicate this in a way that they could impose rules from the outside. It has to be done to some extent willingly. So, yes, it is important to keep that in mind, because I think that is part of what I'm gesturing towards, not just with the political solution, but the political solution as a manifestation of that change in public perception and public consciousness. That, in fact, actually it is what we are deciding. Now, of course, there could be, and presumably would be, many different knock-on effects in terms of Canada's relation with the United Nations and with various other states, etc., if they were to make such a declaration. But at the end of the day, it is essentially a choice that each member state makes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your root cut analysis of this very, very complex situation. It actually goes in many different dimensions in terms of the definition, as you mentioned, the One Health, to me, evoke immediately this notion by a lot of technocrats that they really dream of one-size-fits-all solution because they think they know it all, right? And if we just listen, then everything would be fine. It seems to me, as you pointed out, that we are living a paradigm shift in terms of governance, but to some extent, it seems to me that since the dawn of civilization, there's been a kind of a dream by rulers to control everything. It was not possible. Sometimes they had more control by fiat with soldiers and stuff. But nowadays, the main way to control is information and the connection of people across the world. And because seems to be able to connect in a virtual world with internet and stuff, I think that people in the ruling class, the technocrat, think that it's now possible to actually control the world because they have technology that will allow them to do that. So we are sort of back to the same sort of conflicts between what I would call the subsidiarity principle as a model of governance versus a top-down governance with wise people that know it all and will do it for our own good. The issue I found in terms of fighting that, and you've mentioned a few areas where we could actually be more active and combat it, is that human beings being what they are, no human beings is infallible and can actually fall prey to corruption. And some people are more susceptible to that than others, but in the end, if you have good institution, this will actually keep that under control to some extent. So as you move the control or the regulation or the exercise of power in any area higher and higher, what is going to be the control mechanism to ensure that the wise people on those boards are smart enough and I would say honest enough to do the right thing? And if they don't, then what? Who's gonna be the arbiter that say, guys, you're not doing the right thing, we need to change you, we need to take care of your conflict of interest? Who's going to rule that? That's, to me, seems to be the issue, and I don't see of any solution to do that in a really high-level international governance where the people there are not elected. Where's the accountability in this system? And is it possible to do it effectively?
It has always struck me as a kind of a strange conundrum that we can recognize that people are inherently fallible at the very least and corruptible at any rate. And yet those from that very same pool of fallible and corrupt people, we should be able to pick people who will then rule over vast swaths of humanity for the best interest of all. It's always struck me as a strange contradiction in terms. But the question ultimately, I think, answers itself, because as you say, as we get further up that ladder towards more and more centralized control by fewer and fewer people over more and more of the globe's population with less and less accountability, obviously there is less and less mechanism for there to be actual control when people start to act in fallible and corrupt ways. So the obvious answer to that is, well, then we need to decentralize and get down closer to a local level where people have more accountability over what's going wrong. And as was raised earlier in the questioning, I think it's important to understand that the idea isn't that that would somehow solve the problem of corruption or fallibility. Of course, there would still be problems in various places, but there would at the very least be a plethora of different alternatives that people could turn to. Well, if I don't agree or like this particular paradigm of governance, well, there's this other one just over there. And I think the expansion of basically the competing systems of control, at any rate, competition is generally good, and it is, I think, good in the concept of creating positions of power and control. Of course, being myself, I tend to take that to its logical conclusion, which is ultimately power should be decentralized all the way down to the individual. But I know that's seen as a radical idea for many. At any rate, I would be happier if the institutional momentum was going in the opposite direction and less power was being ceded to the centralized authorities rather than more.
Thank you very much.
Good morning, James. Thank you for your testimony. I tend to judge organizations by the mantra that you use, and I noticed that you mentioned DIE, diversity, inclusion, and equity. So when I think of that from the WHO perspective, I think of Taiwan, and I don't want to get into the one China, two states issue, but I think of Taiwan wanting to apply to be a member of WHO since 1971. They've continued to make that request and they continue to be denied. And then I think of your testimony that there should be a parallel kind of movement for democracies of people who are free. Would it be possible, in just kind of taking all of those thoughts together and make it a possibility for Taiwan and Canada to agree to move forward as a free and democratic society where persons have personal autonomy and continue to work outside of WHO and instead of Taiwan trying to become a member? I know in 2022 they were looking at observer status, but even as an observer status, as you allude, we don't really have input and the opportunity for feedback. So I'm just wondering, would that be a starting point if we could get democracies outside of WHO is rejected to start the movement?
It certainly would be a possibility. And in fact, often I find it interesting that we get so normalized and conditioned into the status quo that we forget that there was a time before the status quo. So thinking, for example, about the international sanitary regulations that became the international health regulations, as I say, there was a vast sea of bilateral and trilateral and other deals between various nations for quarantine regulations and other medical procedures that pertained at that time. And it was seen as just this horribly complex mess, and, well, we have to sort out, where is this coming from and what needs to be done with it and blah, 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 rather than just one overall international health regulations that all of these states will agree to, and it'll make it easier. But in fact, the very same technologies and other things that are being talked about now that could make, for example, digital health certificates, i.e. vaccine passports or what have you, feasible, is the very same technology that would make those types of bilateral relations, Canada agreeing to work with Taiwan, and we will set up this particular regime of health regulations and controls and whatever between our two nations. That would actually be, and to imagine if Canada did that bilaterally with every country that they traded with or had relations with, why would that be difficult in this technological age where knowing the process for importing goods or whatever can be obviously put into an app and put on everyone's phone? It wouldn't be a difficult thing to do in this case. But now we've been so trained into the idea that it must be handled in one overarching international health regulations that governs almost every state on the planet. Why? So I think we do need to interrogate that fundamental assumption. And it should be noted that there are alternate organizations to the World Health Organization that are out there, the World Council for Health and other things, which are predicated on the idea of individual human autonomy, bodily autonomy, health freedom, etc., rather than the principles of the World Health Organization. It's just you don't, or most people don't know about the World Council for Health because they don't have the funding of the pharmaceutical industry and others behind them.
And then my last question is just about Taiwan itself and how they managed through the pandemic. When you think of Taiwan being a little bit bigger than Vancouver Island and housing 23 million residents, I'm just wondering, and at the end of somewhere in the pandemic when I checked on how they were doing, they had 8 deaths. And I just kind of think that maybe we should be following what they were doing. And so when we talk about health and WHO being mandated to protect our health, and then still rejecting Taiwan as a viable example, I just wonder what your thoughts are there.
Well, as I understand, you did hear testimony from Denis Rancourt, and I have interviewed him about the mortality statistics surrounding the so-called pandemic, etc., that, as he testifies, indicates that there was no identifiable wave of deaths that were attributable to some novel virus, etc. So, at any rate, I think that does show something about just the way that we count and order these statistics could have an effect on how the country managed them. But even if we were to accept at face value just the terms of the World Health Organization and other presumed health authorities about how to measure these statistics, I will note that the Independent Panel for Pandemic Preparedness and Response has an interesting admission on their recommendation report, which is available on their website, namely that they look at the different measures that different countries took for pandemic preparedness before this so-called declared pandemic took place, and they plotted them against at least the reported death rate in each country. And you can look at the graph that they came up with, which shows that there was absolutely no correspondence whatsoever between the compliance with various pandemic preparedness ideas that are being propounded by the World Health Organization and the ultimate outcome in terms of measured death rate from the pandemic. So I don't take those statistics seriously, but those are the official statistics, and you can look at them and see that, for example, Canada, highly compliant, getting a 93 out of 100 score for external evaluation of pandemic preparedness, and yet having one of the top death rates in this graph. So it shows that whatever they are proposing in terms of pandemic preparedness and in terms of how we should position ourselves for the future is demonstrably, quantifiably, according to their own statistics, clearly made up nonsense. So I don't know why we should be putting any faith whatsoever in these proposals from the World Health Organization and others about what to do for pandemic preparedness.
Thank you very much.
James, those are the Commissioner's questions. There being no further Commissioner questions, on behalf of the National Citizens Inquiry, I sincerely thank you for joining us today and sharing this information.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks again for tuning into another episode of the Independent Review. See you next week.
Do you see a shift in the media or in kind of the overall consciousness on people being like, we've been lied to for 6 decades about this. It's time to have a reckoning, and where do we go from there? Because it's
do
such
I
a big
see a
lie.
shift in the media?
Yeah,
Public
Tucker
consciousness,
Carlson
Mike, or-
posted.
Well, Tucker.
Well, some media.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Tucker's saying things that nobody's ever said before.
Yeah, which is, I mean.
But a lot of the media, it used to be, we did an article on this in The Defender, how the CIA, it used to be illegal for the CIA to propagandize the American people. And it was part of its charter, and they're not allowed to do that. But then, and then we found out they were doing it illegally in 1973 during the Church Committee hearings when they released the family jewels, which were all of CIA's big secrets. And we found out that there were hundreds of journalists and editors of major newspapers, including the Washington Post, the New York Times, CBS, that were all being run by the CIA. The CIA at that time said, okay, we won't do that anymore. We'll stop propagandizing Americans. We're going to continue to do it abroad. So the CIA, through USAID, is the biggest funder of journalism in the world. It has moles in every country, in leading journals in every country. But it said we're not doing it in the U.S. Although most people did not question them, did not believe that.
Yeah.
But then during the Obama administration, President Obama issued a national security order that allowed the CIA to once again influence American people by capturing reporters. So you have particularly liberal newspapers, and we did an expose on this that people can look at, like Dick Russell in The Defender, that looked at the sort of the major newspapers that are agency controlled. The Daily Beast is one.
Oh, yeah. Didn't he write The Man Who Knew Too Much about Richard K. Snagel?
John Avalon used to run it, and he's an intelligence guy. Noah Schlackman at Rolling Stone. Rolling Stone used to be a counterculture.
They had your great article in 06 about the 04 election that I always cited to people, and they scrubbed that from their website.
Yeah, they scrubbed all of my stuff.
It's like we loved Bobby 20 years ago when we were talking about election fraud, but no, we can't talk about it anymore. And even they had the E. Howard Hunt thing with his son.
Yeah, in 07,
talking about
St. John Hunt,
calling the assassination a big event. I mean, what
no,
the hell happened to
They
Rolling Stone?
used it, right. Rolling Stone. But the other ones that have the same issue are Scientific American, National Geographic, Salon, Daily Kos. We've shown how a lot of these have direct connections to the intelligence agency.
They're all pro-war now.
Yeah, they're all neocons.